Hello and welcome to the Dark Side. Thank you for joining us this evening. We are your hosts, Tabitha Purple and the Mr. Storm right there. He will be with us shortly. We would first of all like to extend our thanks to everyone who has contacted us to wish us good health and prayed for us. I really appreciate it. Yes, last week had to be cancelled, unfortunately, due to Mr. Storm's ill health. This week, we decided to go ahead despite the crushing headache pain that we were experiencing. This flu is no joke. We just have the flu. And so the joys, we're back and we are live. So first of all, we always have the news stories. I was hoping that Mr. Storm would be able to join us for the news stories, but we will go right ahead. Of course, the first story of the day is the Ukraine news. We are at day 18 of the conflict, the war in the Ukraine, the Russian invasion. And I will be honest with you that there was a point when the missile hit the nuclear plant that I thought, goodness gracious me, we're all going to war. Like, it seemed inevitable. Looking at the situation today, it seems so much harder to see and so much more painful because you're observing this happen. The people are flooding out of the country, of course. People are staying to fight. Men and women are fighting, and they're fighting for their lives. They're fighting to defend their freedom, their way of life. But what is really striking me is that the world is really reluctant to get involved in this. And the massacre continues, but the world is really reluctant. And we haven't been as reluctant when it comes to other places in the world. And it's always quite interesting to me where we get involved and where we don't. You know, there is such a political will around it. It isn't about justice. It's not about freedom. These are, you know, it's not about the amount of people who are killed, but the world reacts in different ways to war. Really differently. And so, you know, you have wars that happen in the Middle East region in which the West have gotten involved and have, in fact, not only just gotten involved, they have been protagonists of those situations, and that's been problematic, and they've done that. But then in other countries, they just go, oh, well, you know, it's not up to us to go in. And I think as a citizen of a country, as a resident in another country, as a human being in the world, I think what we have to recognize is that whatever might is happening, it clearly isn't because we care. That's not why we go to war. You know, that's not why we declare a certain people the enemy. There are other reasons, and I think that that's really scary. And I think in this case, watching the Ukrainian president and the Ukrainian people beg the international community to come in and help them stand up as they fight for their own lives, and to watch it fall on deaf ears is really difficult. So, you know, the missile strikes have now happened closer to Poland. Poland has been concerned about this from the very beginning. The neighboring countries, Hungary, and the other countries, were always concerned that this was one of many countries. And, you know, Putin ain't backing down. He's being destructive, and it is happening. And so it looks like at this current moment on day 18 that nothing he does will prompt actual defense of the people. And that is really scary. Especially because we're a 24-hour drive away from the Ukraine. That's really scary. But, you know, I think it's really scary that when we look at wars around the world, and you see this across the Middle East, you see this across Southern American countries, you see this across African nations, the wars that we get involved in are, while they will give the political rhetoric to us, we care about the people and no one should suffer and we're bringing them independence. The reality is clearly not true, because when the Ukrainians are begging you to get involved, they're asking for your help, they're giving you permission to be in their country, they're saying, come help us. You go, oh, well, I don't know. And so there's been some interesting turnarounds, and we obviously pray for the Ukrainian people, as we do for everyone who's involved in conflict. And we stand up against tyranny. I mean, it's just ridiculous. You can't go into somebody else's country and just declare them to be yours. That's not how that works.
It isn't?
It's colonialism at its finest, right? Colonialism at its finest. Now, you prefer a different layout, so let me give you this layout because I know you prefer this. Anything to add to? We obviously did at some length go through the history of the Ukrainian struggle. There are lots of points to be brought out always, but is there anything you want to add at this point?
Oh, cream. Yeah. Okay. Cool. Look, it's a mess. It's always a mess. There's a lot of issues and a lot of feelings that I have with this, and it's perhaps quite nuanced. Because on one hand, I'm like, I feel sorry for y'all. And then I see the racism and I'm like, screw y'all. You know, it's having to balance those two realities of what's happening to you is unjust, but you in turn are turning around and being unjust. And
there are different stories coming to light about that. You know, there are other stories where the people are standing up against that injustice and saying these people deserve to travel out just like we do. And so even within that, there's nuance, right? There is that nuance.
As I said, it's yes. I'm not saying, as I said, it's very nuanced. At the end of the day, though, it still seems to be a systematic problem.
Yes, but that's because we all know on this platform, especially, that racism isn't about the individual, it's about the system.
Right? So
you being racist as an individual makes no difference to me. Like, the individualism muck me out, but it's the power and the structure, right?
Yeah, so like I said, it's juggling those feelings. It's also the concept of Europeans feeling that war on European soil is a foreign concept.
Oh Lord,
I mean,
that whole thing is a joke.
you had the inbred this week talking about,
you know, I wasn't even going to go there because it was an absolute utter joke. How are you going to say it's so foreign to us to have a war on our land when there hasn't been a time of peace in Europe? When was the time of peace?
Forget
We've had
that.
systematic wars.
You have all this money. You have all this money for private educations, and you seem to have missed 2 world wars.
Well, you've missed 2 world wars, of course. But in addition to that, when was the time? Because, you know, there just hasn't been, you know, after the world wars, there were still other wars that happened. There were still other systematic issues that happened. And we've talked about, you know, different Eastern European countries that still were, you know, experiencing terrible traumas, terrible atrocities. What are you talking about? And then, of course, you know, there is always the irony of the land which gave us the 100-year wars is going to be talking about it's a surprise to have a war in Europe. Don't be so ridiculous.
Yeah, but the point that I'm trying to drive here is that there's a real arrogance and a real superiority, a belief in superiority that comes along with these attitudes, that war is something for violent, uncivilized people over there. You know, wink, wink, black and brown people. And we white people shouldn't have to experience that. Right?
You shouldn't have to experience you're drilling down on everyone else.
Yeah, as I said, it's a real it's a real nuanced response that I have to this, you know, and sometimes I'm just like, well, here you go. Sucks to be you.
I think that, you know, for me personally, it's always standing on the side of saying, as unjust as you might be as individuals or within that, it is wrong. And I believe fundamentally it's wrong for another country to go into your country, stick a flag in it and say it's mine, and to do it to slaughter the people. I thought it was wrong when you did it in African nations. I thought it was wrong when you did it in Asian nations. I think it's wrong when you've gone across the Caribbean and the Americas. I think it's wrong that you do this action of going around sticking a flag in something and saying it's mine, I declare it thus. And when the people resist you, you say, die, and then kill them. And wherever that's happening, be that Europe or elsewhere, that action is wrong. You shouldn't just, you can't.
No, I'm not saying it's wrong. Listen, let's not get. I'm not saying it's wrong. What I'm saying is, do I actually have the emotional energy to divert to this when I know the minute you're not having to deal with this mess, you're going to be trying to oppress me?
Well, I think, yeah, it's very nuanced, as I say. There's no simple, you can have both things be true at exactly the same time. I disagree with the invasion of Ukraine, and I disagree when Ukrainians in authority pick power and play power politics and try and arm and try and hold hostage students from African and Asian continents. Like I disagree with those two things at the same time. I can disagree with both of them. They just happen to be happening in the same land at the same time, which is really scary. But that brings us on, I think it brings us nicely onto this idea of the nuance of living in the world today. Because you would think, right? So Europeans are quite consumed with wars in in the war in Ukraine. The news is quite consumed with war in Ukraine. So you would think that they don't have much time to do anything else. And yet still, the news is still full of lots of other injustices in the world. So this is International Women's Month. It's Women's History Month. And you had International Women's Day just gone. And I got to learn about some new history that I thought I'd share with you, because why not? So apparently in 1975 in France, all of the sex workers decided to go on strike. They all went and took refuge in churches across the country, went on strike, hundreds and hundreds of them. And they did it because police had been systematically issuing fines to the workers, not to the people actually participating or the ones abusing the workers. But anyway, they had been systematically imprisoning them, abusing them, and making their lives even more difficult than they already were. So the sex workers decided to take a national action, and they went into churches and they hid, and they went on strike. Of course, the irony being that the people who were being bullies and being mean about the whole trade were the very ones who were using the trade, so had to come to their knees and say, okay, we're sorry, and change the process for dealing with prostitution or sex work. In fact, I should say sex work in the country. I found this really interesting because when we think about these very nuanced situations and conversations around people's freedoms, rights, and what they can do, oftentimes marginalized communities, which sex workers are not safe. They are not kept safe, and not much has changed. You know, people are willing to pay, but the workers themselves have no rights and receive no safety from those who have the power to do that. Instead, they are criminalized, ostracized, and yeah, it's just not good. So I thought I'd bring a little bit of history that we didn't know. It's there for people to see. There's a small documentary available if you want to have a look at it. It's if you want to educate yourself this Women's History Month, but it will bring us nicely, or not so nicely, onto the next story. Anything you wanted to bring up for Women's History Month? International Women's Days past?
What, in relation to the story that you just said?
In relation to the story I just said, or something that tickles your fancy for International Women's Day, or I don't know, or Women's History Month?
Listen, you say it's the people that were abusing the women that were calling for them to come back. I'm pretty sure it's the wives of the people that were abusing the women that were calling for him to come back.
Yeah, the irony of the whole situation, isn't it? It's that double way of dealing with people. The world is a very strange place, but brings us on to our next news story, which only happened but a few short hours ago. Naomi Osaka was playing in the Indian Wells Championship, and the hecklers were out and reduced this poor girl to tears. You would think, with an entire war on our doorstep, inflation through the roof, people suffering with diesel, petrol, gas prices going up, the cost of living's going up. People have lots of things to worry about. So Black people, Japanese people wouldn't be high on their list of things to worry about at that time. But apparently you can take yourself to an entire tournament and then heckle and yeah, cuss. Now this actually mirrors what happened 11 years, not even 11 years, 20 years previous, when sort of the Williams sisters played at the Indian
Indian
Wells.
Wells.
And it was the Williams sisters who were being heckled. So 20 years later, not much has changed. The Williams sisters actually boycotted it for 14 years, refused to play Indian Wells because of the trauma that they suffered. And they talk about literally, if I look at the quote here, it says she was like, I'm not going back. I just don't think she should do this. What if they start booing again? It was really hard for her. She obviously had a form of PTSD from that tournament of being, the Williams sisters being there, being heckled, being booed, being jeered. It not helped by the fact that one of her opponents, a Russian player called Elena Demenitivi, I might not be saying that correctly, accused the Williams father of being manipulative, and then this just gave rise to this behavior of racist abuse that was hurled at this family. It's just shocking that it's not shocking. It's not shocking. I keep saying it's shocking. The treatment is shocking treatment. No one should be treated that way. But it's not surprising that in the midst of all of this trauma that we're all going through, everybody's having to deal with the impending doom, or the feeling, or the sense that there's going to be a World War III, the sense that Vladimir Putin is going to have nuclear weapons, going off or aimed at any other country that wants to get involved, so on and so forth, that your prices, that your standard of living is slipping away. People can't afford to put, gas in there to heat their homes or to put in their car. Either one of those things in certain places is becoming impossible. That food prices are rising. There is scarcity of certain products that were produced in Ukraine. All of these things are happening. And in the midst of that, we still have time for good old racism. And we still got time. We still got time to have people booing and jeering and being racist towards a woman who's coming out to play sport. A woman that we know is well documented that she's introverted. She doesn't, she has trauma from all of these sorts of things. And you're going to let's layer it on top of her. Let's just be even meaner. And nobody does anything. They didn't throw him out. They didn't throw the people out that are jeering. This is just culturally acceptable. You can come to tennis matches and act in those ways, and nobody kicks you out.
Yeah, but I mean, come on. It's to be expected.
It's to be expected, he says, and then just takes a sip of a tea as if it's nothing. I've realised I've lost a page of what I want to say. For some reason, the page that I just did has gone, so I'm going to have to look at it in a different way.
No, it's not that it's nothing. It's just that it's expected. That's the reality of it. Ever since the Williams sisters had their racist abuse down there, and the initial response of the tournament organizers was to defend the people that were abusing.
Mm.
You know that's the culture and that's the environment that you are walking into.
Yeah, but I mean, I think it's like you've had 20 years elapse. We've got further away from that point. Of course, the Williams sisters have gone on to be amazing. You've got 20 years worth of campaigning, 20 years worth of anti-racism work, 20 years worth of highlighting the oppression of people of color in the States, highlighting the abuses that happen. A lot of education has gone into it. A lot of people, you've got the last few years since George Floyd of, the increase of in book sales and education surrounding anti-racism work and the systematic oppression. And 20 years later, we're still doing the same thing. I just think it's disappointing. I just think it's really disappointing that it almost feels like and time stood still. Like nothing changes.
Because nothing has.
I find it disappointing. Yeah, I guess to that end, I guess we should get on with our main story for today. So that's the news. I could have picked a lot of other horrific news that has happened. There have been people murdered and all sorts. And I just decided that with all that's going on, we'll just stick to those three stories today. There's a lot of injustice in the world in the middle of a war. It's quite something. Anyway, the news story I want to cover, or the main story that we want to cover today, is Me Too and schools. And the reason we wanted to go, or the reason I wanted, because I've pushed for this, is that Mr. Storm here shared a video with me of a news story out of the States, and it was talking about it's in a place called Midland. It's the Trinity School of Midland in Texas, and 4 administrators had been arrested because they covered up, they failed to report, and had left students open to abuse. In short, the case itself was horrific. It was a student who had been sexually assaulted with a baseball bat. I couldn't even fathom anything like that. It was like the case itself was horrific. But on top of the case being horrific, what we then saw was the systematic abusive nature with which this school not only covered it up and refused to investigate and refused to do their duty as mandatory reporters to have this child safe, but when the parents were getting involved and trying to resolve it, of course, and have it investigated and prosecuted, they were offering all sorts of things, as well as threatening the parents with legal action to stop the parents from taking it any further. You owe us tuition money because it's a private college. We will waive that tuition money if you will walk away and just leave it alone. So this student has gone through this horrific incident, has forgone their education for the time being, and I'm sure for quite some time as they recover from the trauma of what they're doing, and hopefully they're getting therapy. And in the midst of all of that, these people who are supposedly educators, who are supposedly mandatory reporters, are supposed to be working for the best interest of young people and children, are there committing some atrocities. So when I heard that story, it kind of triggered something within me that reminded me of my own school experience, reminded me of my own experience in the world as a woman at school. And the last person on the call said, one of the things we've talked about a lot is the Me Too movement, but what we've not talked about is Me Too as it pertains to the school system. And when she said it, I thought, she's got a really good point, because if I think about my school experience and I think about other women's school experience, abuse is not unheard of. It is normalized. So then what? And so today I just wanted to have that conversation. And I will be honest with you, as always, Mr. Storm has uncovered some stuff that will frighten the life out of us. So let's go. Let's talk about it, Mr. Storm. Me Too in school.
All right. So in 2021, there was a report commissioned by the UK government and Ofsted. Excuse me. This report they surveyed over 900 students from 32 different schools around the UK.
Mm-hmm.
And what they found was that there was widespread sexual harassment, um, and that it was so prevalent that schools should operate as though it is happening, even without specific instances.
Whew.
Right? Just take it for accepted fact that this is happening, and you need to operate as though it is. Although nobody has reported anything to you, irrelevant. That's how widespread it was. Um, so what they also concluded was that sexual harassment occurs so often that it should be considered commonplace. Right? Um, where is it? Girls were reporting unwanted touching in school corridors. Okay. Um, that children, especially girls, did not want to talk about sexual abuse because the fear of being ostracized by their peers was not worth it.
Mm-hmm.
They were also, however, and I think this is really disturbing, they were also worried about how the adults would react and about being blamed for what had happened.
Blaming. Mm.
Okay. Um, they also concluded that school leaders and teachers underestimated the scale of the problem, and they did not identify sexual harassment or sexualized language as being problematic. Right. And that there was insufficient guidance and training for teachers in this area. Now, these aren't all of the findings. These aren't all the findings. These are some of the main findings. But I want to dig down into some of the statistics that come out of this because it's actually quite frightening. So, child sex abuse cases that were recorded by the police in the UK were 83,000 for the year ending March 2020. Now, this isn't just in schools. This is
This is
throughout
across the
the
board.
UK, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that was a 267% increase on 2013. So what that identifies is that the problem of sexual abuse, harassment, um, on or amongst children is increasing.
I
Right?
mean, to say it's increasing is a bit of an understatement there, love.
Mhm.
That's not just increasing, that's increasing by 200% now. That's
Right?
ridiculous in such a
Now,
short time. Whew.
of this, research indicates that quarter of these 83,000 involve perpetrators under the age of 18.
75% over 18s, 25% underneath. Woo! Ah, it's not good.
So,
Here.
what those statistics say to me is one, you got a pedophilia issue.
Yeah, right. 75%.
I'm like, 75% are over 18, you got a pedophilia
You
issue.
got a pedophilia issue for sure.
And the other thing is that somewhere, somehow along the way, your society is breeding sexual predators. And I'm not using that word lightly. You are
No.
actively breeding sexual predators.
It's quite scary because, of course, children, you always think about the safety of children, but when they're not safe from each other, that's really frightening.
Mhm.
I we've taught our children to be looking out for those who are older who are offenders. But if a quarter of cases are happening to between the ages, between children, between young people, and you asked me this question earlier, how are they even equipped to deal with that? Like, I've been taught to look out for the predator who's an older person. Oh, you pervy, older, you paedophile, blah 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 blah. That person. I've not been equipped to deal with it coming from the boy sitting 2 rows back in the class or next to me in the lesson,
Right.
or the girl sitting
And I
across the
think
corridor.
the report does actually highlight the fact that they're not equipped, or not necessarily. Well, no, they're not equipped, but the report does highlight that children and young people are much better at identifying adult or outside predators or outside threats,
Right.
but it's much harder for them to identify it within group or peer to peer.
Mm,
Okay. And I think whilst we're talking about the not being equipped, I think there's a real issue here in that the teachers aren't equipped to deal with this. They're not trained
right. No.
to
As a
deal with
former
this,
teacher, no.
right?
No.
But the children themselves aren't
Right.
equipped, not
Right.
just to deal with the sexual harassment,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't believe they're adequately equipped enough to deal with the changes that they themselves are going through. So
Right.
what you're going to have at this point is hormonal changes. You're going to start having attraction between the different genders, different sexes. Interpersonal attraction is going to start occurring.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is, who teaches people how to manage these things,
Mm,
right? Who gives people the skills
mm,
to deal with this? And, I mean, I think back to when I was a kid, and even as young kids, really young kids, one of the things I'm talking about prepubescent,
mm-hmm.
right? Pre hormonal changes, pre all of that.
Mm-hmm.
You say to a boy or a young girl, "Oh, that's your boyfriend." And what is their response? It's very
No.
negative. No, it's very
Mm-hmm.
the concept of that interpersonal relationship
Mm-hmm.
is something that by time they start going through the hormonal changes and that actually starts taking place, they've been trained and taught that that's not a good idea or a
Mm-hmm.
good thing,
Mm-hmm.
you know? So now they're grappling with what they've been brought up in that
Mm-hmm.
society and actually, no, I'm feeling these attractions.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So you've got to wrestle and grapple with that. As you know, and all these changes you're going through,
Mm-hmm.
who's guiding them through this process,
Yeah.
right? So for me, I look at it and I'm like, this is a recipe for disaster
Right.
because for most people in life, you throw them into a situation in which they haven't been given the skills to cope,
Mm-hmm.
it's usually going to end with a negative outcome,
Mm-hmm.
right? Um, so I do agree with the fact that there needs to be more training, but one of the things that the children themselves highlighted
Mm-hmm.
in this report, in the survey that they did, was that they didn't feel that the reproductive and sexual health classes that they received were good enough and were equipping them for this. So there's a failing um, within the educational system to
Right.
provide children with what they're saying we
Right.
actually
Yeah. Yeah.
need
Yeah.
that's going to equip us for life,
Mm, mm,
you know. Um, and so I look at some countries which begin sex education a lot younger,
mhm, mhm,
and I'm starting to question, actually, is that a better method to go,
mhm,
um, in terms of just normalizing the fact that actually at some point you will become attracted to someone else? you will start to have these feelings. You will start to, and so you begin to tackle that training that and the socialization that young children experience at a much younger age.
Well, I've kind of lived both sides of this conversation in some ways. I've lived the side of being the teacher who's responsible for teaching PHSE in the UK, where you have to teach sexual education as well as everything else as part and parcel of that, and having the training or not, as the case may be, to execute that. Being in the position of being a young person going through the system, and also being a parent. In another country which has a different policy on how sex education is done. And one of the things that I've noticed when we're having these conversations about sex education and children, our society, or I would say Western societies, often have puritanical kind of overtures to them, where bodies are simply mechanisms for sex. And we see that all around us in society. Like, that's all that your body is meant for. It's, you put this in there and that's what you're doing. And so when we mention the idea of giving sex education to a 5-year-old, everyone goes completely ballistic, because how could you tell a 5-year-old about sex? And it was like, and for me, I think what I've come to realize is that if a 5-year-old doesn't understand the parts of their body, doesn't understand boundaries, doesn't have a clear idea of this is okay and that is not okay, at 5 I should not be doing this, then how is that 5-year-old going to navigate 6 years? And if the 7-year-old hasn't had another lesson to teach them, this is my body, forget putting body parts in body parts, but this, you're not actually teaching children about their own bodies, and when we think of some of the failings that parents have when they call, vaginas and penises hoo-hoos and cookies and, ridiculous names, and don't name things correctly, you're setting this child up to be in a system that is, it feels like it's going to eat them alive. It's not going to they're not equipped. They just don't have the vocabulary for dealing with anything that comes their direction. And that is problematic. And so when we talk about the kind of age ranges of sex education, I can hear people already, oh, how could you teach a 5-year-old about sex? Well, how come the 5-year-old doesn't know what a vagina is or a penis and cannot do basic look down and tell me that these are my private areas and they do not go near, and you do not come near my private areas. You don't get to touch this. How come the 5-year-old can't say that? That's problematic.
I would counter people that would say, how can you teach a 5-year-old about sex education? I would counter that position by simply pointing out it can be done constructively or it can be done destructively. And we know that there are many children out there that are having it done destructively, that are having it done to them against their will.
Yeah.
Right? So you have to start at some point to educate them. This is your private genitalia. It's private. Nobody's meant to be troubling with it. That is part of sexual education.
To be able to name your own parts of your own body, it's the basic things you start with a child, isn't it? This is my nose, this is my fingers, these are my toes, this is a vagina, this is a chest, this is a tummy. Kids should be able to name the parts of their body, and then you should build up age appropriately, or at least in my opinion, age appropriately, that conversation as the child grows. It should be layered. You can't start, in some countries they want you to start with sex education at like 14, 15. The horse is already bolted. They know they have private areas. I mean, what you're starting with, this is a vagina and this is a penis. I mean, what are you saying at that point? Obviously this is a dark side. It comes on late, so we're not expecting you to have your kids up watching this, but I do worry that in people's puritanical ideas of what a body is, you're missing something fundamental about humanity. Like, what is your issue here? Surely we can talk about these things without having a nervous breakdown.
Yep.
Just
So, yeah, that's my thought. One of my thoughts that I think it should start earlier. Some more statistics. In 2015, police reported, or it was reported to police that 4,000 physical sexual assaults took place
in schools.
within schools.
You know, when
Right?
you asked me this question earlier today, I couldn't believe that we're at 4,000. I was like, what are you
4,000,
saying?
right? And 600 rapes. Okay.
600 too many. Like, what on earth is that?
Yep. And this was between the period of 2012 and 2015.
You know what worries me about this is that we know that in adults, reporting is low to non-existent. Now, we've covered the Me Too, we've covered the abuse of women, and we know that reporting is low. So if you're saying 4,600, what frightens me about that is how much is going unreported.
Yes,
How many
absolutely.
of
But
these things go unreported? I mean,
but that
that's
was one of the findings of this report, that many girls were not reporting, or it just wasn't worth the hassle of reporting because they would be ostracized. So it's a lot higher than these figures would indicate. But what they were saying was that of these 4,000 allegations or reports made to the police and the 600 rapes,
mm,
not all of them were pair on pair.
okay.
In other words, not all of them were pupil on pupil.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Okay. Many of these things couldn't be proved. Right. So then what happens? Right. And I mean, what happens when I say it couldn't be proved, yes, there's a problem within the peer to peer abuse.
Mm-hmm.
But the real question is what's happening when it's not peer to peer?
Well, and we have the 2 court cases within a very short time, people being arrested in school systems who are
Mhm.
covering these things up, who are mandatory reporters and are not reporting, people who are trying to brush it under the carpet, children are being withdrawn from school, and it just goes not dealt with. You know,
Oh, mm, the real question I'm asking here is how safe are our schools when a significant number of the perpetrators are actually the teachers? And what I've given you so far are UK statistics,
mm,
right? Um, look, this is my view. Typically, whether to a lesser extent or not, what's happening in one area of the world is happening all over the world,
indeed.
right? So when I give you some of the US statistics, you should be able to draw some form of correlation between the two,
Mhm,
right?
mhm.
So let me just find this because right. So in 2006, the American Association of University Women reported that 80% of sexually harassed students were harassed by other students. That leaves you 20% that were faculty. Yeah.
That's really disturbing. I mean, it's really disturbing that 80%, of course, are being harassed by your own peers. That's one thing. It's really disturbing to think that teachers are getting involved in that. Like they're the ones perpetrating sexual harassment against a student. I mean, you're put in there to teach a lesson, not to be ogling and eyeing up and harassing I mean, what's wrong with what is wrong with you?
Right.
Literally, what is wrong with you?
So to put that in a perspective that perhaps some people in the UK could understand, typically a student in the UK, high school student, will take 8 to 10 subjects. Chances are 2 of your child's teachers are harassing them in some form or manner.
That's disgusting. I mean, it really is quite disgusting. It's just really disgusting. Anyway, continue on. They give
Okay.
the profession a bad name.
What's that? Sorry?
I said they give the profession a bad name.
Yeah. 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 Right. So there's also within the statistics. So you've got the statistics. As I said, you have to look at them because once you look at them, they raise questions. So, for
Mhm,
example, the one we just did, 80% are peer to peer.
mhm, mhm,
Well, then the question becomes the other 20%, right? So I
yeah.
want to give you another statistic. This comes out of the UK. In 90% of the recorded offenses of rape in 2018 and 2019 for the demographic of 13 to 15-year-olds, they were committed against girls.
I mean, 10% are against boys.
And for me, that is a hidden statistic. And by that, I mean, when we talk about the sexual abuse and harassment,
Mm,
typically we go automatically to women,
yeah,
and they are vastly disproportionately affected.
90%.
Yes, but it's because we go to that and we say this is a problem for women, we put into place systems to protect women. But 10% of any community is a sizable percentage of that community. And if there is a problem in that 10%, it's a ticking time bomb.
Mm,
And so I look at this and I'm like, yes, we need to look at how do we improve this for women who are
mhm,
vastly disproportionately affected. But at
mhm.
the same time, we need to address that 10% or we're simply creating problems for later on down the road.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And which we know that that is a case. That is the case. That this does become problematic to men, to the men as they grow. Like it becomes a ticking time bomb for them to process and deal with the abuse that they've suffered in the school system. I think anyway, do you have more statistics you want to share with us before
Well,
I
I think what
comment?
I would say to this, what I would say to this is that within the UK, you have the problems, ticking time bombs, um, and that they might go on to themselves become abusers,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
Vastly different, however, to the US, where you have school shootings weekly.
That
And
and you
so
see this is yes.
and so
Yes.
if you don't know that
Yes.
this is a problem that needs
Yeah.
to be addressed, because
Yes.
the majority of school shooters are male,
Right. Right. All right.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And this needs to be addressed. And I think also because I want to talk about the fact that girls are socialized to accept this from a young age, right? That's something that needs to be discussed. Boys, however, are socialized that this shouldn't happen to them. And to
Right.
have that done to them emasculates them.
Right.
They're seen as weak. They're seen. So what's going to
What
happen,
do you think's gonna happen? Yeah. It's literally a ticking time bomb. And,
right?
and I have some statistics here that talk about the impacts of sexual assault and how serious and long lasting they are. Um, and that if you are sexually assaulted, um, physically or even just the abusive nature of sexual abusive conversations around adolescence, then the adolescents themselves tend to experience higher than normal levels of depression, anxiety, post-traumatic symptoms, risks of being assaulted again. It puts
Yep.
them at higher risk of being assaulted again. So this idea also, even saying that they become offenders themselves, oftentimes it isn't that they become offenders, it's that the majority don't become offenders. What they become is sufferers of post-traumatic stress, sufferers of depression, anxiety, mental health issues. All of that becomes now higher in that population that has been assaulted than in the non-assaulted population of young people. And so you find that this long-lasting effect, they then struggle to form healthy relationships, to do to go through life's kind of the normal steps of growing and forming families, etc., for themselves. These are all things that are a leftover from being abused as a young person, as an adolescent. And I think that that's something that really that we need to talk about. I think sometimes we give the we need to give that balanced view that these are long-term effects that people will suffer from if they experience abuse. You will have this anyway, but especially if you experience it as a teenager, as an adolescent, you're going to have this long into your adulthood, because a lot of times that trauma is not validated, it's not believed. You don't always know how to process it yourself in the moment, and then you go out into the adult world and realize sometimes after the fact what's happened to you. It's the after effects of what's happened to you. And I relayed this to you earlier today. I said, if I think back to my school experience, the treatment I got as a young woman at school, and that was normal around me, as an adult now, I'd be guns blazing in if any kid behaved like that to me, to my children, to anyone around me. I'd be telling everybody that's not the right kind of behavior. But at the time, it was perfectly normal to have boys stick their hands up your skirt, try and bust open your buttons of your shirt, pulling on your bra straps, making overly sexualized jokes, grabbing on parts of your body. That was all perfectly normal. And it's not until you left the environment that you were like, I was literally sexually abused at school. Like, it, because it's such a normalized part of that system, and this is just how they behave. And as a young woman, you're just trying to get through this narrow window, not be popular so you don't end up, overly touched, groped, or what have you, not be unpopular so that you don't get overly touched, groped. There's this like small window that you're trying to negotiate so that no one touches you unwillingly. But if you asked me at the time if I'd been assaulted, I would have just looked at you really blankly, because an adult would do it.
Right. So to kind of buttress what you've just said, the 2021 report from Ofsted and the UK government. So of the girls that they surveyed, they reported that the following happened sometimes or a lot. Okay, this is their perception of what's happening. Okay, sexual assault of any kind, 79%. Right, feeling pressured to do sexual things, 68%. Unwanted touching, 64%. Pressured to provide sexual images of themselves, 80%. Pictures or videos that they shared being sent more widely without their consent, 73%.
Dear Lord.
And sent videos or images that they didn't want to see, 88%. So that is the perception of the world that girls in schools are living in. Now, I want to contrast that by giving you the statistics for how boys are experiencing this.
Okay, go
because
on.
I think it's important to understand that actually there's a socialization that's taking place, and I think that you can start to see that through the difference in the statistics.
Okay.
So, for sexual assault of any kind, 38% for boys.
That half the number.
Mhm. For feeling pressure to do sexual things, 27%. Unwanted touching, 24%. Pressure to provide sexual images of themselves, 40%. A picture or video that they shared being sent more widely without their consent, 40%. And being sent videos or images that they don't want to see, 49%.
So that's literally almost the percentage that's missing off the girls. Like the girls are at 80-90% for everything, and the boys are at the other end. That's
Well, I think,
insane.
well,
That's really
yeah,
insane.
the yeah. Um,
I mean,
I think
for me,
what
it's really scary the normalization of all of this, that it's just normal, that, that is the normal reality of being a teenager at school, is that you are going to experience sexual content you didn't ask for, sexual touching you didn't ask for, sexual assault that you didn't ask for. And, when you see the boys' figures, I think what's scary is that that number's probably increased quite a lot. It would have been lower, I would imagine, but it's probably increasing quite a lot because you're talking about digital images that they're being pressured to send,
yes,
and stuff
but
like that. I think, whew,
what this speaks to is, as I said, this has to have happened to them, um, or someone that they know directly, right? So in terms of the sexual abuse, how many can report it? What this says to me is that the boys are experiencing the world in a very different way to the girls.
cold.
Because what you have to understand is that these girls are their peers, and they are going through this daily in the corridors, in the classrooms, daily. But the boys, as they see it, they are not experiencing it or seeing it as the girls do. And
Mhm,
part of that is down to the socialization of the two,
mhm, mhm,
right? In
mhm,
that girls are being taught to accept it
mhm.
and boys are being taught to do it. And you see this in simple language that we use around dating or relationships between boys and girls. It's a responsibility of the boy to chase the girl, right? What does that automatically do? It sets up the dynamic of predator and prey,
Right, right.
right? And so the predator is powerful, exerts its will on others, and the prey might put up a resistance, but it's typically going to
It's gonna roll
submit
over
to
and
the
play
will of the
play dead.
predator,
Yeah,
you know?
yeah.
Um, so you have that sort of dynamic going on.
Mm,
Um, but you also have the sexualization of or where women are taught that they are sexual objects.
right.
And there was the Amber Ruffin, comedian. She did a piece um, on I forgot Pocahontas. I can't remember what her real name is,
Mhm, mhm,
and someone from Marvel drew a comic.
mhm.
And what they did was they had her in this small bikini, like
They
Amber
had her in
Ruffin.
pasties. They didn't have her in a bikini,
Yes.
it was pasties.
Okay, pasties, and Amber Ruffin's doing the thing. Look, there's no straps to what's covering her breasts. There's no nothing. It's just how's it staying up there? It's defying gravity. And what she was talking about was the sexualization of this person.
Mhm,
That wasn't true to the historical story and the accuracy of the
mhm,
story.
mhm,
The problem with this is that what it does is it presents the image of two women that they're to be sexualized,
That's it.
right? They are sexual objects.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
so, what do guys see when they see women? Sexual objects. You grew up reading
Mm-hmm.
comics. Listen, I grew up reading comics. X-Men. I mean, half of them were running around in leotards and bikinis, you know?
All but naked.
Uh, you know? I mean, some might counter and say, Superman was running around with his undies, but he had a full bodysuit on. They were pulled
Thanks.
up over his
Thank you.
body was fully covered up,
Thank you.
right?
Right? Batman in
And
his
so,
undies, in a full bodysuit. Like he is
yeah,
covered from head to toe. All of them, as much as you're going to turn around and say, oh, but they're wearing, covered head to toe, covered in clothes.
I mean, Batman comes out in a bulletproof suit, and Wonder Woman's just in, some small skimpy
Miniskirt and bra
corset,
top.
you know. Um,
Corset, miniskirt, and some bangles that are going to defend her. Because
so I'm
bulletproof
like,
skin,
look,
surely.
we have to be mindful of the images and talk
Yeah,
about how
yeah,
you're socializing
yeah,
boys and girls from a young age, so
yeah.
that when they come in to the environment now where their hormones are starting to change and starting to develop, these interpersonal relationships or attractions, what have they already been taught? And once again, this comes back to why sex ed classes are important, because you're able to start teaching people about normal, healthy relationships.
And it
You know?
happens on a societal wide basis. This is a
Mhm.
systemic problem and it needs a systemic answer. To say that as families we have a responsibility, absolutely we do. But there is an entire socialization processes that happen in as a society. In order to combat that, it needs a societal wide approach. We can't leave that down to, well, this family is doing a good job and that family's not, and this family can have the conversation and that family can't. And we're back to square one, which is where we've been stuck in a lot
Mhm.
of countries for a long time because of these issues. These are societal wide systemic problems that are not getting solved by us sticking our head in a pit and pretending it doesn't exist.
Right. Now, I'm mindful of the time because I've got a lot more statistics and stuff to do, and I'm not going to get through all of it, but we're already going over an hour. So, and there's a lot more I could say on the socialization of this, but one thing I do want to point out, or this is another study. Um, oh gosh, I haven't even touched on how porn interacts in this. Jeez. Um, but okay, so to do with the socialization, there was a study. I can't find it in my notes, but what it was. Oh, here we go. It was a 2007 survey revealed that, or what it speaks of, is that a possible cause for sexual harassment is actually gender policing, right?
Women
And
know this.
right, so the but I mean, actually, the how it manifests itself, or how they're saying it manifests itself, is that if a guy exhibits behaviors that aren't seen as masculine, then he will be bullied. He'll be called gay. He'll be called all of these things. And
Mhm.
what that does is that it then provides reasoning for other guys to then act in ways that will be seen as masculine
Yeah,
or accepted as masculine, in order to avoid that abuse.
yeah. And it also, it excuses the abuse of the boys. So
Yes.
the boy who's on the receiving end of that initial kind of bullying, um, you know, gender policing can often be the boy that is then abused sexually abused because it provided the cover for that behavior. It
Yeah,
gave the
yeah,
excuse and the
absolutely.
reason, and then it builds the layers of the picture up. And so, because we are talking about, of course, sexual abuse in peer-to-peer in school, that is kind of some of that reasoning behind the screens.
Mhm,
Is it gives that cover, that veneer, of this is what's acceptable. And if we look at the news story we started with a baseball bat to this poor
mhm.
child, you're talking about, it was in the sports room, the bullying aspect, and then people commit these offenses under the guise of, well, he was being a whatever anyway, and he's this, that, or the other, and he likes it that way, and you're being abusive. Yeah, it's really scary. It's just very scary.
Yeah, look, as I said, I'm mindful of the time. Look, I haven't even gone into how they talk about porn and the impact of porn on the relationships. Um, but just, to give you some worrying statistics, is that there was a survey done in 2021, and a third of those that they surveyed, and I quote, learned more about sex from pornography than formal education, end quote.
But you're not learning about sex from pornography.
Right. And so,
You're
as
not
I
learning
said,
about healthy sex from pornography.
right. And that
Contrary to
was
what anyone believes.
right. And that was one of the things that it goes on to talk about. It goes on to talk about that this is an unrealistic picture or image of sex and sexual relationships. And actually, that young people are aware that this is unrealistic. Okay. However, 60% of boys and 41% of girls had used it as a source of information to learn about sex and sexual relationships within the past 12 months.
You know what
So
frightens me about that? Go on. Anyway, finish your point.
now, for those that don't know why this is problematic, it's because within porn, it depicts men as aggressive and women and as submissive and sexually objectified.
Mhm,
Okay.
mhm.
Um, so if you have the majority of guys saying, I learned more about sexual relationships and encounters through porn than I did in my sex education classes, how do you think that's going to manifest in the real world, right? Where, as I said, in porn, men are depicted as aggressive and controlling.
Right.
Okay. And the women who 41% say that within the 12 months they had learned about um,
Sexual
sex,
practices from porn.
and it's teaching them to be submissive. It's teaching them, or what you have then is a dynamic of in the real world, you're going to have an aggressor and you're going to have someone who is submissive. And what does that lead to? Right? Because now, when somebody is or a guy is interested, what have I learned about sex? Or if I'm attracted to someone, I need to be aggressive, I need to be controlling. Well, what behaviors is that going to lead to? It's going to lead to sexual harassment. That's the that's the natural conclusion of things. But let's take that aside. So even if you say, okay, well, that's not a big issue for you, then this should really be the main issue. And that is that those who frequently associate with or watch porn tend to victim blame.
It's time to get up and leave the room and be like, I'm done with this.
Right?
This
So
madness,
you have
right?
to understand that that is desensitizing you
Yeah.
to when assaults and crimes take place. you were more likely to turn around and say, it was her fault. What was she doing? Was she drinking alcohol? What was she wearing? And this, as I said, these are studies that were done. This was a 2021 study that was done. It was called Pornography, Young People, and Preventing Violence Against Women.
Yeah. I've
Right?
seen similar studies done in the UK I saw a study done among London schools, and it really scared me
Mm,
to read the accounts. This one was like a long study where they did in-depth interviews, and it scared me to read the accounts of the women, to think how much of the women, of the children's responses, um, and how much of that I counted as abuse and they thought was normal, and how facing the reality of that had led them to self-harm, depression, suicidal ideation, because they couldn't process what was happening to them, because, well, they'd seen it in a porn something,
mhm.
and that's just what everyone did, and if they didn't do it, then they'd be ostracized or something, and that pressure, it was really scary. Both boys and girls, the boys who were forced, cajoled into participating. If he's the only boy that doesn't do the group sex act, then there's something wrong with him. If she doesn't participate and sleep with all the boys, then it's a problem, and it was really scary to read those accounts of people that are going to be in therapy for a very long time, trying to process what happened to them as teenagers and how the system had let them down. It wasn't pretty. It's just
Right.
not pretty.
I just want to come back to Daniel's comment that maybe there should be a healthy porn if that's the best medium of education. First of all, it's not that it's the best medium of education. It's just that it's better than what is currently on offer. Secondly, look, if it is the best medium of education, then sure, let's go for it. But as you say, you're not making it, neither am I. And the only reason I don't want to make it is because I don't want to make you feel inadequate.
Oh, shush your mouth.
So
That's
I'm,
okay. You
I'm
guys
not trying to make other guys out there feel
being
inadequate. So,
silly. No, but visual okay, so let's actually take this point off the table to a certain degree and put it on seriously. Let me bring it back to a kind of more normal conversation. If we're talking about healthy porn, what you're talking about is sex educational videos, which are quite different.
mm,
And there are sex educational videos that exist. I know that my children have seen them at school. And I think my kids are quite aware of all the birds and the bees, and they've had sex education. We're in a different country. They have it from quite a young age. And videos are available that show how these things work and interact. The problem that you're encountering isn't that children are learning healthy, they're trying to figure out what sex is from these videos. They're often trying to figure out what everyone else is doing. So
mm,
someone will have been sent an image that they don't understand, that they haven't been prepared for, a video clip that they don't want as part of the process. And then they're having to go figure out, well, what does that mean? Who does this? What does that look like? And then they go down the rabbit hole of seeking these pornographic videos, not necessarily even in the first place out of I want to understand the mechanics of sex. They might have that down, but what is this that you sent me? You know, whereas before, boys might have gotten hold of, or girls might have gotten hold of the copy of Playboy, they're now sending full out nudes, mini videos, social media, and the smartphone computer in your hand has meant that sexual content is available readily at your fingertips within 2 clicks, right? And
yeah,
so therefore, the young person is receiving something, or something's been said. It only takes one in a group to have access or to have been exposed, and it sends the whole group into a tears. The problem being that the dynamics, as you say, of young people is that they're not equipped with boundaries. They've not been taught from a young age, this isn't appropriate, this is appropriate, this is what my body is, I don't like that, say no. They've not been taught that from childhood. So by the time they get to teenagers and this stuff is now landing on them every day, and if we talk about sexting, if you talk about unwanted pictures being sent, I mean, as adults we talk about dick pics and how inappropriate that is. Can you believe that men are just flashing women on a regular basis as if that's normal? Think about that now in the teenagers, completely
Right.
unprepared,
So
and you get those images sent to your phone.
just to put, well, first of all, okay, yeah. So let me address you, and then I'll address what Daniel said. Just to put dick pics into perspective, 20 years ago, a dick pic would have been a stranger in a park in a trench coat,
Right, but this is it, you're
right?
flashing, you're a
And the
flasher.
police will be chasing them down because
That
you
part,
will be seen as a threat to the public.
thank you.
This is no different,
But
right?
somehow
Right.
it's
So,
prevalent.
yeah. Now to address Daniel's comment. Look, Daniel, I know you're joking, right? As I said, I know Daniel
Yeah,
personally
we know
very
you
well.
well, we know the joke.
So, just in terms of you saying that seems to the medium that young people gravitate towards, what I want to say is that part of the problem that young people gravitate towards this medium is because they haven't grown up in the comfort of being open about sex
Yeah,
and relationships,
yeah,
so that they have nowhere else to turn that is safe.
right.
Now, I can put a video on, I can watch a video, and it's going to give me information. I can Google something and get a video or an article or a website that's going to give me information. And I don't have to interact with an adult or another human being. And so I don't have to feel that embarrassment about having to ask the question. And that's why the medium of porn works so well for young people, because actually I get to see things, I get information, I get knowledge, and I don't have to deal with the embarrassment of having to ask someone. And this is why I'm saying if we can normalize these conversations for young children and set the boundaries around it,
Mm.
then perhaps they'd be more comfortable asking these questions, and if we could tailor if so in the 2021 report that I mentioned, the children were saying themselves that their classes weren't adequate. They weren't giving them the knowledge and the answers to the questions that they had and needed. So of course they're going to turn to somewhere else, right? Um, so I think that is something that we need to be mindful of. If they're saying this isn't suitable for us, then we need to provide something for them that is suitable.
And I think this goes back to an earlier show that we had where we talked about the sexualization within parental conversations. And we started it off with a meme, discussing this meme that was going around Christian circles, talking about how it's never okay to be naked at home. It's never okay to have this. It's never okay to have any level of nudity or anything like that because it's corrupting of the children. And it's like, well, if your home is not a safe space for you to exist because everyone believes that a naked body is only a sexual object, what do you think is going to happen to that child in the world? They will be completely ill-equipped to deal with their own body. It's never been normal at home. They've never had a normalized idea of what a body is, all of the different functions. Sex is just one function in your bodily, your stuff.
Hmm.
It is just one of many things that our amazing bodies do. But if you've never had any environment in your house that normalize the human body beyond a sexual function, it's inappropriate for you to see this, it's inappropriate for you to see that, because there's some kind of weird sexualization that you shouldn't have with your own with family and children. And they came out of your own body. There should be skin to skin contact at birth. There should be all of these normalizations of humans and nudity, because your body isn't just a sexual object. It shouldn't be reduced to that. And so if that's all you're doing in your home, then when the kid goes to school, has inadequate lessons until they're 15, 16, 17, 18, what do you expect they're going to do other than look at the lovely internet for questions? And the internet will provide you answers that maybe you weren't prepared for. Like, Google isn't always right. There's a millionaire lady who made an NFT. She made $1 million because she made an NFT out of her unsolicited dick pics. I can't even with people. I can't. I mean,
look, I'm
I
like,
can't with people.
there's one
We're
thing that
overtime and I just
there's
can't.
one thing that she's receiving unsolicited dick pics, but I want to know who's paying for these pics.
Well, it's an NFT, so isn't it only one person who owns the thing?
My point is, who's paying for it?
Listen, somebody bought the NFT. That's all I know, and she's now sitting on a pretty million, happy with
Right.
her plethora
So,
of dick pics that she's received.
mindful of time.
How do you have so many dick pics? Anyway, go ahead.
So, look, I know we have to bring this to a close. So,
we do. Me Too and schools.
Right. So, Me Too in schools. So, I want to bring it back onto subject. Me Too and schools. My view on Me Too in schools is that the Me Too movement has failed schools. And the failing of it is apparent from the very name of the movement. Me Too. It is an individualistic movement. This happened to me. It should be us too, them too. This is a plural issue that affects pretty much, when you look at it, all women. And the problem with the Me Too movement is that it focuses on where you are now and it ignores where you came from. It does not do enough work in schools. It does not do enough work for younger girls in particular. But I think it's not just younger girls that need the support of this movement. It is also young boys. It is young people, full stop, that should be included in this conversation. And perhaps it should be renamed to them too, because you have been through it already. And I'm not trying to diminish your trauma, but you can get help for that. But you can prevent it from happening to others. And so for me, I look at these statistics and I look at these numbers, and I'm sorry for the trauma that adult women have gone through. But more work needs to be done to prevent any more young girls and boys from having to go through this trauma.
Yeah, I'm probably not. I'm probably going to disagree with you slightly and say I'm not going to lay that on the doorstep of Me Too. I think it started as a hashtag. It started as a trend. It's grown into something that has been life transforming for women across the globe. But I think you're right in that for all of us who have survived school, survived the trauma, survived the abuse that we suffered at the hands of school. I think one of the challenges that we have is that until the Me Too movement, a lot of this went unidentified. Until the Me Too movement, a lot of this just went as, this is just what we all experience, shrug our shoulders, this is just life. I don't like it, but it's what we experience. And the lived reality of being a woman in the world. And I don't mean that flippantly. I'm not, I've shared very candidly on various ones of these, the kind of experiences I've had. But it is, sadly, my experience tells me that this has been a normal part of my life experience. Having a daughter myself, people ask me, is there a difference between raising your boys and raising your daughter? And the one thing I said is I didn't really see any gender difference between the two sets. They were both as equally hard work and rambunctious, and they did the same sorts of things, except this. When I held my daughter in my arms, I knew that the world was going to be unkind to her, and it frightened me, and I felt like apologizing, and I didn't know how to change it. And that's the reality of being a woman in the 21st century, that sometimes you do have a moment to take stock and realize the traumas that you've been through in your life. I have a great therapist who helps me process and deal. I advocate that for everyone. And on the other side of it, this is why I wanted to do this one, because there was something about Me Too and schools. There was something about this hidden, it's almost hidden disease that we've afflicted society with, that we have just normalized. It's part of growing up. If a boy likes you, he pulls your pigtails. When boys are teenagers, they bust open your shirt, pull on your bra straps, lift up your skirt, do all kinds of sexually abusive things to you in school, and you're not safe. The teachers are not doing anything. Other students aren't coming to your defense. You can't even come to your defense because it is seen as normal. And in doing that, we are subjecting generation after generation of women into the victim role, into accepting abusive behavior, and then wondering why as adults they can't get out of abusive relationships and they can't say no to certain behaviors. How come they're not doing this when we've told them from the time they're little that when boys like them, they pick on them and bully them, and kiss chase is normal, and predatory behavior is okay, and that boys, when they're being emasculated and bullied to the point of sexual abuse, this is normal, as if this is a normal adolescent behavior, when quite frankly, it's not. And that for me is the scary part, and has been the scary part, rightly said, as Daniel points out here, that it's scary being a parent, because you sometimes think of the abuse as happening by strangers and adults and blah, blah, blah. But what you're not really accounting for is their lived experience of walking through the schools. And as a woman holding my daughter, that was a real stark contrast than holding my sons. I felt it in my soul. And, I almost wanted to apologize to her that she's going to grow up in a world which does not favor women and is abusive, and there is the abuse of boys that happens at school. And I'm not trying to minimize that. But when you're talking about statistics like 90-10, I have to bear in mind that the overwhelming majority of these victims are girls. And for me, that's really scary. And you're right, we do have to do better, and we do have to hold schools accountable, and we do have to figure out how to do the education thing in a way that is healthier and breeds healthier environments for young people to grow, develop, and learn about sex, attraction, interactions, so that people aren't going to have life of therapy and PTSD because they just went to school. I mean, that shouldn't be a reality. Well, from your silence, I see we've come to the end of the dark side this week. Thank you for sticking with us. Thank you for listening to what is a very scary conversation. Let's continue the conversation beyond this moment and find ways of helping, educating, being a part of the young people's lives in schools and far beyond, where we can actually impact change and make it so that this doesn't happen to another girl or boy again as they walk the corridors of school. This was The Dark Side with TC Storm and me, Tabitha Prepple. Thank you very much for joining us. We will see you next week when we'll be discussing an equally traumatic subject, I think. Thank you so much. We do need to have more of these conversations. Thank you, Daniel, for your interactions today. We do need to hold more of these conversations. We do need to widen the conversation beyond these spaces into schools, into holding teachers and others accountable. Parents all need to have and be part of this conversation. Any last words, Mr. Storm?
Yeah, well, I guess when Daniel brings out his range of suitable pornographic educational material. We'll have to have him on the dark side to discuss that. Of all the people I know, I think this might be the one time I'm not going to ask a friend for a freebie.
You're going to support the cause of buy in. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. I'll pay him not. I'll pay him not to give it to me. Yeah.
I can see his wife's face now. She goes home. She's like, "What did you agree to do now? You're going to be doing what?"
Yeah.
Welcome to the dark side, folks. We can laugh as much as we cry at these issues. Have a blessed and beautiful week, and we will see you next week on the dark side, 9 p.m. Central European time, where we aim to be an hour, but somehow always manage to be an hour and a half. Peace, blessings. Have a good one. Bye-bye.